Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to the High Fantasy Podcast, and today we have another author interview for you. Today we're interviewing Miss Faith Taylor McKinstry. Faith is the author of several series and short stories, including an epic fantasy series called The Chronicles of EALIRON, a high fantasy series called The Fell King, a story collection called Wizards, Woods, and Gods, and a dark fantasy novelette called Water Dark. Faith is an old-school fantasy geek with a deep love for fantasy, science fiction, and the esoteric, of which she was an avid reader. With a background in computer electronics and software development, she wrote and illustrated technical documentation for many years, during which time she created fantasy worlds. She is inspired by plant and animal lore, Northern European legends and mythology, fairy tales, mythical creatures, music, medieval warfare, and shamanism. You get all that? So, just a couple notes. So we didn't actually know this when we first were interviewing Faith, but she literally lives in the forest, like in what was it? Is it New Hampshire? No, not New Hampshire. Vermont. Yeah, I think it was Vermont. In the middle of, like the middle of nowhere in Vermont, which is really cool. But there's going to be a little bit of audio disruption here and there, and we can thank the miracle of Skype interview technology for this as well. So yeah, what else? Also, on behalf of both myself and Shalini with the High Fantasy Podcast, we want to give a shout out to Mr. Michael Evan. He's our author liaison of sorts. Really excellent dude, and he's connected us with all of these great authors that we've interviewed and have put out podcasts of our conversations in the last several months. And he also is the admin of the Fantasy Focus Facebook group. So if any of you folks listening want to check out other cool content from other authors and high fantasy creators out there, this is a great group to be a part of. There's always interesting posts and content showcases, and it's quite fun. So again, we just want to thank both Michael Evan and the whole community with Fantasy Focus for you guys' support. So if you want to check out the Fantasy Focus Facebook group, just click the link in the description. So back to Faith. Shalini and I, of course, had a great time talking with her. And as you can tell from the laundry lists of different interests and influences in her life and writing, we had a really good in-depth conversation. This is actually one of our longest author interviews, I think, and we hope you enjoy listening. And without any further ado, Miss Faith Taylor McKinstry. Thanks again for coming on to the podcast, Faith. Please describe your writing and the Chronicles of EALIRON.
Well, let's see. I was, as it said there, I was a fantasy nerd as a kid, and I think it was then that it first occurred to me that I wanted to write this stuff. I took a long before I finally get to that. And the Chronicles of EALIRON was actually the first thing that I wrote, the first series that I did. The original version of that, it was like this 250,000 word monster. And I was kind of cut my teeth on that, sort of it was like a training ground. And it's been through like countless incarnations since then before I finally got it published.
It sounds like you've been writing that one series for quite a while. Approximately how long have you done it for?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I started originally putting it down, I don't know, sometime in the 90s, probably it was. I worked on it for a long time, and then I took a hiatus somewhere in there where I just got tired of the whole thing and I just stopped. And then I picked it up again, and shortly after I did that, I completely gutted the whole thing and started over. So it was, yeah. Yeah, because everything had changed by that point. You know, all the stuff that went into it the first time was all different. And that's kind of when the character Lorth of Ostaran showed up. I thought of him later when I decided to rewrite everything. And then it all kind of developed around him and his whole thing at that point. So it barely resembled the original thing. It was all just learning how to write, developing my style, coming up with building the world, and it was just a million little things that went into it.
Yeah, sometimes you just really need to get it out of your system to actually start writing the story. I found that
exactly.
Yeah.
It's remarkably similar to yours, to Shalini's.
So I was 11 when I first started writing my novel, and it's a science fiction fantasy.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so I'm still in the process of figuring out what it is, and now that I figured it out, I just don't have time as an adult to, actually put a lot of serious thought into it. So, yeah, it's coming along.
Yeah,
but,
and you have also talked about living in the woods to write the book.
Yeah.
So
yeah, lots of parallels. I feel like just fantasy is part of, and we'll probably talk about this later, but fantasy is so conducive in an environment where it's, you're isolated and you're in a natural environment too, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, kind of let the imagination run wild.
Yeah.
I grew up in Houston, Texas.
Mm.
I left home very young, and the first thing I did was come north to New England, to the woods. Because it's like, it felt like I was a changeling or something. I was born in a totally wrong place. But yeah, the fantasy writing thing was definitely a huge part of that.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Are you a kind of like a Henry David Thoreau kind of person where you go into a cabin and you kind of wall yourself in and get lost in your own thoughts, or?
No, that kind of describes my house. I went in there and stayed there. I'm pretty reclusive. I live out here in the woods, and it's not like I have zero human contact. I don't want any human contact or anything like that. And the internet is probably a complete godsend, because without it, I would be amazingly isolated out here. But yeah, it's kind of, and it's not that I moved out here just to write fantasy. I moved out here because it's the kind of place I wanted to live, and writing fantasy just kind of is part of that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's a component of the lifestyle of.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
There are many benefits.
Yeah, so you brought up your main protagonist. I don't know if you would call him a hero, or I guess that's something that we can discuss as well. So Lorth of Astaran, he seems like a very dark and kind of anti-hero character, and he's a solitary hunter who seems like he has a deep understanding of who he is and what principles drive him. He also kind of seems to set that mood of like a sort of dark, enigmatic setting for your books. And you mentioned that he kind of came after you started writing the world, but what sort of attachment do you have to Lorth and the archetype of an anti-hero? And was he always an anti-hero from the beginning? And how did that kind of come up?
Well, wow. Well, characters, they have kind of a life of their own, and I don't remember the process of how I went through it, but he came up, and I just started writing about him, and he kind of just became who he is, as I went. I didn't start out having this whole big thing mapped out or anything. I kind of just let it play out.
Right.
And it's really kind of the only way I know how to write. I hear about writers who write these elaborate outlines and things, and I'm like, how can you even live? I don't know how people do that, honestly. I'm envious. Anyway, I never thought of him as a hero or an anti-hero. I guess he's a little of both. And at the beginning of the story, he thinks he knows what he is and what he's about. And the story is kind of about how little he knew about what he is and what he's about. He's very kind of ambivalent and conflicted around a lot of stuff. And he returns to his homeland after a long stint doing what he does in another country. And he gets drawn into just this nasty series of events that just gets him in all kinds of trouble, and basically just puts his face right up against all the crap about himself that he thought he knew but has no clue about. And it's kind of how he becomes who he is, really. It's ultimately what the story's about.
Interesting.
Yeah. It sounds quite similar to a lot of the kind of story arcs we see in classical mythology.
Yes.
Like real heroic characters. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
And it's strangely psychological too. Like, people don't usually psychoanalyze classic fantasy or mythology necessarily, but a lot of it has to do with coming to terms with your own demons and even Yeah, and even though there's external demons or, you know, external villains,
literal demons.
yeah, the
Right.
biggest obstacles are often the ones that we have in ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you write fantasy, you could be, you know, integrating and dealing with your own personal demons, or you could be integrating and dealing with, you know, collective. You know, it's like fairy tales and mythology, how it's basically it's all metaphors for something.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that's cool about fantasy is I've written books and stories that had like these very powerful metaphors for things like within me, usually, or something else. And I didn't realize it or figure it out until like 5 years later. All of a sudden I thought about it and went, oh my God, that's what that story was about. And I never realized it when I was writing it.
Right. Yeah. I totally have that too. The book I've been writing since I was a kid, I actually realized a couple of years ago, it's actually an immigration story, and a lot of, I think, fantasy where there's the real world and then a secondary world where, you know, the main character goes to the secondary world. It is sort of an immigration story because they travel to another land and they have to, you know, assimilate or reject that culture. Yeah, figure out who they are, if they stay there for a long period of time. You know, how to interact with those people. And in my story, the characters have to make a decision to come back and save the first world that they like, you know, were born in, or to stay with that world. So it kind of has
that's a tough decision. I know. I know which way I would go.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, would you go back to Houston, Texas, if there's like an issue, or would you stay in northern Vermont? So yeah, it's that kind of that kind of a dilemma, I guess. So yeah, and that only comes in retrospect, I think.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
A lot of the authors that we've interviewed, they currently live in a place that's not their home and far from it.
Yeah.
And lots of international experience as well, especially these days. We spoke with a couple of authors. One of them, he teaches English in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
There's so many variations of this, and it's definitely reflective of, like you said, I think a broader human experience where many people, they do leave where they are from, and there's still that part of them that never really goes away, but they also reconcile with the new place that they're living and the fact that the world is a lot bigger than the little hidey hole that they were born in, you know?
Yeah.
And I've got that in my story too, and interestingly enough, mine, because, you know, I was born in Canada, and in my story, the characters don't leave the continent that they're from. There's more than one continent, but they're just going to a different part of it. And I go, it's kind of the exact same thing that I've done. I've just basically went from the East Coast all the way out to the West, and I thought it was an interesting.
Way in Canada.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's quite different.
Yeah. We do end up dealing with some of these things that would happen to us in a psychological manner, and creating all these narratives about it. I mean, I'm sure we can make a fun story about going on an airplane and landing in a different town, but
yeah, that's no fun.
If there's no dragons, heroes, and challenges, you know, it's a little dull.
Oh, the subconscious does so many wonders for us writers. Sometimes you don't even have to think about why something is the way it is. You just kind of write it and people connect with it. So speaking of the subconscious, I guess art is, I think, a big part of your creative pursuits as well. And the sort of surroundings that you described earlier are featured heavily in your artwork, which I also think is beautiful. And you do most of the cover art for your books, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell us more about your art and what drives you to draw and to paint? And is that connected to your writing as well? Do you find that it's just a package deal where, you know, your artistry and your creative writing pursuits are kind of one and the same, just in different mediums, or is there something else behind that?
I'd say they're one of the same. You know, when I was a kid, I've been drawing and painting my whole life, and when I was a kid, I did read fantasy novels. So a lot of the stuff that I was into drawing and painting as a kid was stuff from fantasy novels. And so the link between the two things was put in very early on. And when I got to a point where I was, you know, self-publishing the novels and I could do my own cover art, by that time I had a huge collection of oil paintings, pen and ink drawings, Celtic art, all kinds of snips and scraps and goodies that I could use to kind of put together and make cool looking covers.
That's
so
awesome.
I did a lot of experimenting before I put them out there, and I'm always tinkering with them. but yeah, it's a thing. Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, I've been drawing since I was a kid too, and I've always kind of made it a point that it's something that I return to. And right now for the novel that I'm working on, I'm actually drawing the characters, and I find that I'm able to better realize the world that I'm trying to build by actually illustrating it. I did all the maps, and I've done like really technical aspects of the geography and that kind of stuff, naming cities, etc.
I love drawing maps.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about those. What's your process like for making them?
Well, what you just said, it's when I'm writing a story, you draw a map. I usually sketch it down. It looks like you can scrawl so I can find my way around, or how far is this place from that place, and so forth. But usually when I'm working on a map, I go back and start making changes to the book. It's like the two things kind of, feed each other. It's a cool thing, and it's just a really geeky thing to tell.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
It just goes to show, our need to kind of at the same time, define the scope of our story. Like, these are all the cities that you should know, and the forests and the rivers and the mountains. But it's also to show how big your world is and how many different sort of peoples there are. And, it's an interesting thing, maps, because, there's so much in it that the human mind can't comprehend, like if they just see all that land all at once. But it also is like to kind of understand the world.
It's a really powerful tool when you're writing a fantasy novel. I mean, whether you know how to draw or not, just to scroll that map down, it's an amazing the things that come up when I'm doing that.
We're looking actually right now, Faith, at one of your maps. It's terrifically detailed. It's very reminiscent of Tolkien's maps, I think, many aspects of the style. And you put a very adequate amount of mountains, and I have a ton of mountains in mine as well, in forested areas.
What's funny? I assume you're looking at one of the EALIRON maps, the pen and ink ones.
I think so. It's Dirigan. Dirigan.
Oh no, that's for the Felking.
Oh, okay,
that's a different
Felking. Okay.
Yeah. The EALIRON maps are done in pen and ink. I did those a long time ago, like originally. And there's so many mountains. It's just a wall of mountains over the whole thing. It's so unrealistic because no actual real landscape would look like that. So
I know.
When I got to the map of Dirigan, the Felking one you guys are looking at, it's a little more realistic. With like how mountains would actually be in a place.
Right.
Yeah. I could totally expect to open one of those encyclopedias of Earth, and this could be on the next page. It's just so incredibly detailed, and I like how you have river systems and they're flowing from the mountains. They're not just generated in the middle of nowhere. Like it makes sense. Right. And you have it looks like a pentagram in the middle of this one, and it's mapped to all the points. Yeah. So that was intentional for sure, right?
Yeah, it's basically it's an interdimensional portal that's made out of like 10 towers that fall on the inside and outside points of that pentacle, and it's in the shape of that. Yeah,
that's pretty cool. I guess another part of maps is the titles of places, and your the names of many of your regions, and even the books themselves are kind of Northern European inspired. How do you go about creating the process of these titles?
Well, I've read a lot of that stuff. I've been reading that stuff for years. So it's all kinds of different things having to do with those cultures and mythologies, and fairy tales and folk tales. So it's sort of huge stew pot that I draw that stuff out of.
Right.
But there's also the internet. You can go out and you can look up Scandinavian names for men.
I've definitely done that before.
Kind of cool when it kind of clicks and you go with it.
Yeah, totally. Continuing on with maps and thinking about the environment. So your work, both written and visual, is heavily featured, obviously, with nature and also history and lore and things like that. Quite common in many fantasy works. Why do you think nature and history are so integral to fantasy as a genre? Have you thought about that, or do you just kind of go with it, or do you have some sort of answer for that?
Well, I never thought about it. That's a really good question. It kind of gets into the definitions of the genre. But I can tell you what it is for me. I think a lot of it comes from fairy tales, folk tales, mythology. The vast ocean of human subconscious kind of thing.
Right.
And a great many of those tales take place in this context, so you have medieval settings, you have war, you have sorcerers and otherworld beings and monsters and so forth. It's all kind of part of the whole, how the metaphors of these things get put out in these old stories and things. So fantasy, I think, is really kind of an outcropping of that. At least it is for me. I suppose all that stuff, I'm very heavily influenced by all that. To begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. When you think about the beginnings of fantasy, you think about Beowulf and King Arthur and all those kind of legends. So, those are classified as fantasy now, but they are essentially folk tales of that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting. I'm a master's student in English, and I'm doing a thesis on nature and fantasy and what fantasy does with the environment and how that reflects how we perceive the environment.
That is awesome.
Yeah. So I'm specifically looking at, after the Industrial Revolution, with Tolkien, and even before that with the Romantic writers, how people, kind of see themselves reflected in nature and the nature that's slowly disappearing from the world.
Yeah.
So, I'm always kind of interested in hearing about what authors think about the environments that they portray in their work. So, yours is deeply sort of integrated into this classical understanding of nature as something that's deep-rooted and important to civilization.
Yeah.
And also spirituality, I think.
That's important to me. Like most of my stories, nature is kind of an integral part of the belief systems of the cultures, that live there. It's not something you would abuse. Of course, you always have things like that when you have war and stuff. You've always got the abuse of nature and so forth. But in a world where it's held in some kind of reverence, where religions and belief systems and things are based on it, suddenly that becomes a huge violation. You can't just do that. You're not going to pay the consequences. Kind of a thing.
Yeah. A side note too, Faith, and I like this, and there's been at least a few rants, well, not exactly rant, but we've brought it up a couple times that in a lot of high fantasy, there's this startling absence of religion. And a lot of the fantasies are, it's also medievalist in character. And there's still that aspect where the goal partly is to try to represent in some manner the Middle Ages. And it was an incredibly, to us today as moderns, just an incredibly religious society. It's something that we would have, I think, trouble comprehending in some ways.
Oh, yeah.
And I made it like a point to have my... the characters in my story, there's different religions in the cultures that I've been writing about, and they're important to them. And for some of them, it's a huge driver of almost everything that they do. It's not just like they kind of exist in a vacuum.
I can understand why fantasy authors might just kind of veer away from that whole thing. Partly because in this world, maybe we get enough of it, we're all sick the fuck tired of it. So,
That's a good point.
But having said that, I think as soon as you have a world with the people, you're going to have some kind of belief in something. I think it's human nature. It's the nature of consciousness to have a belief in something beyond you. Mm-hmm. So I think there's no such thing. I don't think you would have a world where there wasn't some element of that in some way or another, whether you're inventing a religion or what,
Yeah, I think it is a prerequisite, and I think that, and we've already talked about Tolkien a little bit, but for me, one of the biggest detractors of his works, I think, was there's no reference to God or gods and different belief systems in that regard, and
No, but they had reverence for things.
yeah, exactly, and
Yeah.
it's true, and there was things like honor or courage, that these
Yeah.
were upheld as virtues, and those in their own right are kind of like these cardinal aspects of how these societies live and develop, and I definitely see like there's a lot of nuance to it.
There's definitely no one way of doing it. And one of the appealing things about fantasy is that you can kind of create the world that you want, right? So
Yep.
religion can be a certain way in our world, but if that's sort of the driver for you in writing fantasy, you can create your own sort of religion and create the way that people would interact with that religion and that deity. If you want to see, a matriarchy instead of the patriarchal society that we have, you can create that in your fantasy and kind of explore how that would pan out. So in that way, I think it's a powerful tool to experiment what social aspects that we feel like we can't control in the real world, and kind of see what we can do with them. Yeah, that's what Tolkien was kind of doing, because he was a devout Christian, but he didn't necessarily put forward a Christian propaganda with Middle Earth,
he was not into that.
Yeah. So, and it's like it's a religious sort of force that anyone can relate with, right? Like a deep respect for nature and for other people, and those kind of things, like the timeless
Well, in the
values.
ancient religions, it was all centered around that.
Yeah,
around nature, and that was their gods, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another interesting balance to strike, Faith, is between professions, and you have training in computers and software technology, yet you're also, as we've discussed, deeply creative and artistic, and seemingly through your interest in paganism and shamanism, a spiritual person too. How do you reconcile these different facets of yourself, and do they somehow feed into one another? And do computers and virtuality have a place alongside spiritualism?
Well, they do now. When I started out, how I got into high tech originally was a pretty long and sordid tale. But when I got into it, I found that I had a knack for it. And so I was writing fantasy on the side during this whole time, because I never really lost the ember of that. That's what I wanted to do. But for one reason or another, I didn't have time really to pursue that. I had to make a living and blah, blah, blah. So I did the high tech thing. And eventually I went out on my own as an independent contractor. I was a technical writer, and I wrote and designed like online help systems and stuff like that. And at some point, I got really bored with all that, because, my heart kind of said, you know what, this is what I want to do the rest of my life. I'm not doing this. So I made this huge, very extremely reckless life change where I just said, screw this. And I found some other way to get along while I wrote fantasy novels, or got very serious about it. Started, working on publishing them and all that. But what I discovered later was how much the whole foray into high tech helped me, because all of the stuff I learned, and keep in mind, when I started out, it was before the internet, no smartphones, none of that. I think the internet existed, but people weren't using it for things. And so everything I learned, computers, word processors, CAD programs, paint programs, all of this stuff, running a business, all these things came in really amazingly handy when it came time to get into publishing and social networking and all of the stuff that goes along with book promotion and all that stuff. And now I look back and I'm like, wow, I'm really glad I did all that, because this would be a lot harder without it, kind of a thing.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting how those two kind of met up in a sort of happy circumstance there.
Yeah, and I didn't see it coming, because for the longest time I felt like I was in a prison. It's like, I have to get out of this. I can't do this. This is miserable. This sucks. And so it's only the retrospect thing, where I can look back and say, wow, okay. Whatever.
Yeah.
Every sort of trial has its value.
But no experience is
Yeah,
ever
something
wasted,
like
right? So that's a great thing. Because, yeah, I mean, Lainey is in school, and I'm kind of an accountant, I guess, for an insurance company.
kind of an accountant. Okay.
Yeah, you know, like, and so
You just ended up in that. Because Morgan did a degree in history, and he somehow
politi-
is an accountant now.
yeah, it's history and political
man,
science.
okay,
And,
I get it now. Yeah.
yeah, you know, and I don't want to make it about me, but it was definitely a really interesting experience in terms of getting outside of my comfort zone, because I was a really shy,
Yeah.
my whole life shy, nerdy kid,
Yep.
somewhat social, but had like a few friends, and to do something that really requires you to be very analytical, great with working with people and with customers and stuff, and it was a really, for a long time, very challenging. And I think that those definitely translated well into writing, because I have a more, I
Yeah.
think, realistic sense of, how would people actually interact
Yeah.
in a marketplace, in an imperial outpost town,
Yeah, right? Yeah. Yeah.
And I have a better sense of proportion. I do want to pay homage to that past that I have, but
Someone writes an
Yeah.
insurance policy for
yeah, I mean,
for someone else. And
yeah, that voyage sounds really dangerous. We're gonna have a really, really high premium. It definitely sounds like you're gonna die.
It's that's an interesting thing to say, because it's really interesting when you're writing what kind of stuff comes up, stuff you never expect that happened to you in your life, or things you went through, or things you kind of tossed out as just kind of useless. Suddenly it's in the stew pot and you can draw on it.
Yeah, truly it is.
Yeah.
And I feel like as writers, we just constantly want to be in writing and in a writing sort of situation and not do any other profession. But
Absolutely.
and then
Amen to that.
yeah, but then like you realize like, oh, I actually need to live my life to have something to write about.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's always that balance.
I never thought of it that way. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, because if any writer was just a perfectly happy and content person at all times, then what would they possibly write about, other than some kid's book about like a happy face that's just happy all the time, and there's no trials, it's just everything's sunny and dandy outside, and happy face goes home.
Yeah.
I might actually write that just as a parody.
Yeah. And then you can do like a whole range of emoji series books. Then you can go on to sad face and then angry face. And then,
in this day and age, those might actually sell.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, that's
sadly. Yeah.
Yeah. For good or ill.
Yeah.
In terms of that, though, Faith, we did talk a little bit about your writing process, but overall, we just want to see what is it like for you, and do you have a set schedule, and what is it like being essentially a book entrepreneur while also staying true to your creative side?
I don't really have a schedule. I'm one of these truly tormented writers that doesn't have the discipline to sit down however many hours a day you're supposed to write and all that stuff. There's all these blogs where people put that out there, and I'm reading it and I'm sucking my teeth and I'm going, man, that would be lovely, but I can't do that shit. So pretty much, just to put it crudely, the way I start writing is when I'm sick and tired of it in my head. It's time to write this down now.
Yeah.
And then I start, and at some point, the fire gets lit under you, and you keep going because you gotta write this. So I mean, that's kind of a brief and lousy description of my process.
Yeah.
And as far as the schedule goes, right now I'm kind of just doing the pro slacker thing. I mean, the next thing that I'm working on, it just took a long time to come together in my head, and I haven't really started writing it down yet. But I will, because, sooner or later that explosion epiphany thing will happen. It'll be time.
Yeah, you can definitely empathize with like where it is sometimes an urge, and you just have to kind of satisfy it instead of just trying to have it this very technical thing,
Yeah, writing schedule.
There's technical aspects to it, but I think, at least for me, when it comes to actually sitting down and doing it and bringing it, out of the void, so to speak, there's nothing technical about that. It's like, I don't know what it is. It's mysterious.
Yeah, mysterious force.
Yeah.
We've had writers before talking about authors being vessels for the ideas that they write. Sometimes it's, you can plan ahead all all much you want, but then, you know, when it comes
Oh my
to
God.
it, there's a mysterious, you know, force that's writing through you. And I mean, I prescribe to that philosophy too. I mean, I started writing when I was 11, so it's like, it's not like, you know, I had this technical know-how at 11 years old to write stuff. It's more like it just kind of came through me, you know.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so that's, I mean.
But like, yeah, I mean, that's to me just kind of how any sort of creative thing works. And it's, the technical part comes when you have to take what comes through and turn it into something that, you know, I don't know, people might want to read, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. Do you find, Faith, that reading helps you write, or do you find that kind of distracts you while you're in the writing process?
There's two parts of this. People say, well, what advice would you give to writers? And, you know, my first response is read books, lots of them, more books than you can possibly believe you can possibly ever read. And that's how I learned to write, was by reading books. But when I first started writing the Chronicles of EALIRON, like when I put down that first, you know, huge blob of the thing, I actually stopped reading fantasy because I was concerned that I was going to get influenced by other authors.
Right.
And I wanted to do the whole thing kind of in my own space and see what I could come up with without having other things, you know, creeping in there from other places. So I went kind of a long time, you know, a bunch of years anyway, not reading that much fantasy. And as a result, I'm completely behind the eight ball. I'm still going back and reading like what people think of as classics because when they were big at the time I was doing this, I wasn't reading them.
Right. No, that makes total sense though, because I struggle with that as well, because sometimes I lack inspiration, so then I go read books and then I get really excited by what I've read, and then when I try and translate it, I get worried that it might just be, you know, this book 2.0 that I'm writing.
Well, at some point I kind of got over that. Like now, you know, I'm always working on writing something, and I can read books, and it doesn't influence me. You know, I am inspired by things. Like I recently, I'm closing in on finishing the Witcher books, and I love those books. But it's not like the stuff that is in those books is creeping into mine. It's kind of already there. Right. It's almost like I'm already kind of writing that stuff. So it's inspiring, but I don't feel like it's influencing me. I guess maybe because I've reached a point now where my own sort of style and way of doing things is so kind of solidified in that, you know, it's not likely anything's going to steer it off.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I've read quite a few of the reviews of your books that people really resonated with your voice and how it's very distinctive, and you have a very nice balance between lyricism and, you know, driving the plot forward in your sentences. And I did read a little preview of your work as well. I think it was Blood Earth, and it was so interesting and really kind of gripping, the way that you kind of integrate the world and the natural environment again into, you know, how people see the world, and then how that drives, you know, character development forward. So all that to say is that, yeah, I think you found a great balance in, you know, finding your own voice through reading what other people have done before you. Yeah.
And even then, I'll have to say, even though I wasn't reading books, I still have to say it was a long time still after that before I found the kind of the feel of it now when I write stuff, where I've established a style that I feel so confident in, it's not shakeable anymore. That took a long, long time for me to get there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
The only way you can get there is through writing and practicing.
Do it.
Yes.
All the time. Yeah. And I think reading other books helps too at some point, you know, as you see how other people are doing it. It's not like it's sinking into you, but it gives you different perspectives, you know, on how it can be done.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So Faith, for you, what works are you currently involved in, and what should we expect to see from you in the future?
Well, I'm working on the third book in the Fell King, and by working on, I said it's still in my head. I kind of started putting it down, but I don't have any clue whatsoever when I'm going to have that done or when I'm going to. I've always got little side projects that come up now and then, but I don't have like this beautiful little list of things that are coming out that we can all get excited about. Not right now, anyway.
And fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah. I read that on the questionnaire and I went, oh crap, what am I going to say about this?
I mean, it's very interesting. You seem like a very sort of intuitive person where you kind of go with what comes to you at that moment. So it's kind of refreshing to hear that you just go with whatever project that you feel like at that moment, and you kind of have that inspiration.
I mean, there is some planning. I mean, if you're going to actually publish a book, you got to put you got to suss out how you're going to do it and where and when. But yeah, I think the creative process is very much the only way I can really do it is like off the hip like that. And I think that's really subjective. Everybody's got their own way of doing it,
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's kind of how it really should be for writing and for fantasy, because I know one of the biggest things for me personally that is a challenge with just in general with writing is I do kind of have that anxiety about the future where I go. I always feel like I should have something to be working on or to be looking into. And sometimes I kind of retreat from that and I go, well, you know what? Sometimes it's okay to really spend a good long time thinking about something and just mulling it over and then feeling it out. And when the time comes, and it's like you said, like when you really feel like you have that urge and that opening to do so, then you get the words down.
Yeah, I know what you mean about anxiety around that. I have a lot of anxiety. I feel like, okay, well, I got the first 2 books out. Oh, better not wait too long before the 3rd one comes, or nobody's going to read it. Read blog posts about this shit. Make you feel horrible about everything you're not doing. But so yeah, I have this anxiety around it. But then I stopped, and then it's what you just said. It's like I have to do this the way I'm doing this. It's not going to happen until it happens. And, it's all good. Whatever.
Yeah, and it's I guess sometimes it's just a little. I mean, I haven't had this experience yet, but I've gathered from some of the authors that we have interviewed as well that it can be a little bit of an arresting experience to have to kind of tell people, hey, no, like I need more time to do this. And I guess that like a big very public example is with George R. R. Martin and the 6th book in the Game of Thrones series, Song of Ice and Fire, and people have been giving him shit for years for not, but it's like you have to respect the process, and in reality, I'm sure for someone of that caliber, like once it's out, we're gonna be like, this is well worth the wait. And I think that the instant gratification aspect of a lot of contemporary media and entertainment and stuff like that, it's definitely seeped into into this genre for sure. And I think that that
is a good point.
Yeah, I think people need to be a little bit more loud and firm sometimes when it comes to this is really an artistic endeavor at the end of the day. And
Well, everybody expects to get what they want when they want it, and they want it for 99 fucking cents. Don't forget to add that into it. You're absolutely right. That's I never thought of that, but that's true.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and especially with fantasy, because people think that it's since it's speculative fiction, it's not as highbrow as literary fiction, and it doesn't need as much time, and people just write a whole bunch of crap. And it's like, I know. I mean, as an English student, this is what people think in those literary circles, because I'm trying to push for more research and ideas in fantasy and science fiction, and it's slowly coming around, but people are still so hung up about, the classical literature and things like that. It's like, oh my God, they're all the same, they're from the same fabric.
I was going to say, that whole thing where fantasy is not taken seriously because it's all just pulp crap, it's not very, I was beginning to have an idea that we were kind of growing out of that, and that wasn't really true. I mean, you read some fantasy out there, it's just absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's not literary maybe in some senses, but it is in a whole lot of others. I don't know how you could you actually differentiate it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I think it's slowly getting better and better, but people are still, they're still, I mean, fantasy is very addictive in that it's a mode of escapism. So when you don't have, the next installation in a series, you feel kind of empty, and I guess it kind of feeds into our feelings nowadays, where we want everything immediately. So.
That is so true. When I was a kid, I lived in that state of emptiness because I read so much fantasy, and there was always another book. Oh shit, it's going to be another year before I get the next version of this. Now I'm on the other side of it, and I'm like, well, I'm going to be like George R. R. Martin. Screw you! I have to take as much time as I need to take with this, and I'm sorry about your poor little empty space, but I can't deal with it.
No, it's true. I mean, the market is so very saturated with fantasy these days, so there's no lacking of really good books to read in this genre. So people, it's I don't feel too bad for fans of a certain book not getting their needs met.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you go into the coffee place and they don't have your specific special blend that you get every day. It's like, you know what? Time to have an espresso. Time to have a different treat. You know what I mean? Like, come on, people, grow up. Seriously?
Right.
Yeah. I want to shake people sometimes. You don't know how good you have it until you don't have it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, there is a geekish kind of thing around that, though. Around the whole fantasy empty spot when you don't have the next book in the series kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or that absolute complete despair you feel when the series is ended. Then what are you going to do? There's a whole psychology around that.
Yeah, totally.
The circle is complete. Yeah, and I guess to kind of bring the light back into the discussion or happy thoughts and feelings is for the most part, I do believe that for many people it's really they're doing it more out of love, right? Because they're true fans. They have a genuine passion and connection, and they identify with it heavily. And I think that for many people, that comes out in the form of like they write the angry blog posts and they put the videos on YouTube where they speculate about the health or the whether or not the author's gone crazy, and that's why they're not, and they fuel this kind of, this kind of like junk.
Yeah,
culture.
It's a form of affection. Let's say.
Yeah. I it's twisted as it is, but I think for many people
they're
that's
not getting their fix.
Yeah,
and at the end of the day, I think it is motivated by largely good things, but yeah, I think there kind of has to be overall a change in the status quo for that, and not just for literature. This is something like for almost everything that these days.
Yeah,
like
things take time.
Yeah, you can apply this to all kinds of artistic endeavors.
Yeah. I mean, I recently watched a YouTube video of a film critic analyzing CGI in movies recently, and how he was talking about how the old CGI with like Jurassic Park and Lord of the Rings, it's actually like objectively better than the CGI we see today in terms of, the technical aspects and how visceral it looks. Like we can connect much better with the more realistic renderings in Lord of the Rings than in The Hobbit, for example. And he was basically, he came to the conclusion that because we're so interested in getting more content and having that sort of instantaneous gratification, that those developers and the graphic designers don't actually have enough time to create a product that they are really happy with. It's just more like, okay, we got it done, and now it's good enough, so we have to send it to the big film production company and say goodbye to it. And there were so many comments on the video of graphic editors and CGI developers who were like, yeah, this is a true phenomenon. Like, I feel like the projects I work on, I don't have enough time to do it. And it's really sad, like just because they have to reach a certain deadline that they are overworking themselves, but still not getting to the point that they want to in their creative endeavor.
It is a really sad thing to highlight, right? Because it's almost like you're defeating your own enterprise here, right?
If it sucks,
theoretically, yeah.
Especially for movies these days, I think the CGI might be phenomenal, but the writing is terrible.
Oh,
It's
God.
a bad story.
That's a whole other can of worms there.
On that.
Yeah. No,
But
totally.
I do have a lot of faith in the Lord of the Rings TV series that'll come out.
Oh, yeah.
Despite all my instincts screaming that it's not going to be good, I want to believe. I want to be a believer. So.
Yeah.
Well, that's just fear because they're tampering with something sacred, So it's like, yeah, it's gonna suck. It's gonna suck.
Yes, yeah.
It's true.
And that's my own fan, crazy fan part coming out,
Fan persona.
But
I have the same thing going on with the Witcher series on Netflix.
Oh, yeah. Is it on yet?
It's like,
when is it coming out?
Oh, I don't know. Next fall or something. I don't even remember.
Okay.
I don't want to say because I don't remember.
Right.
Longer away than you want it.
Right. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see.
Gratification in action.
Yeah.
We'll start wrapping up now. Thank you, Faith, for coming on to the podcast, and we really appreciated talking more about nature and this sort of slow process of creating our creative ideas into life. And hope you had a great time as well, and we had a fantastic conversation.
I did. You guys are awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you as well. I appreciate that. And for now, Faith, do you have any last minute thoughts about anything that we've talked about today, and at that juncture as well, let us know where we can follow you on the interwebs and yeah.
Yeah, no, I really don't have any last thoughts. I mean, we got into a lot of stuff. That was really great. It's just like a total geek fest. I'm into it. So, yeah, website, ftmckinstry.com, Twitter, ftmckinstry. It's pretty simple.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah,
it's like super succinct. It's my name.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always great when you can get that.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you can get that username. Yeah, no, that's perfect.
Yeah.
And you have a omnibus edition of the Chronicles of Eailorn out now,
yes.
Correct?
It's got the first 4 books. There's also a novella that goes with that, and it's completely standalone. It doesn't have Lorth in it, but it takes place in that world with some of the same characters. That's not in the box set.
Oh, okay. Very cool. Yeah, and we'll have that linked below in the YouTube description bar.
Yeah.
So fans can go and check that out. Yeah.
Cool.
Great.
Yeah. So Faith.
Great.
Yeah, Faith. Again, it's been awesome, and we will hope to hear from you again. We can't wait to get more
insight or information.
Yeah. What's the word? I had a nap earlier. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's been awesome, and I all the best with your works, Taylor. Sorry, Faith. Oh my gosh, I see it on the screen.
That's so funny.
Yeah. Faith, all the best with your works, and we do hope to connect again sometime. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
If you like this episode of our podcast, you can follow us on our social media to get updates on our future episodes. On Facebook, we're at facebook.com/highfantasypodcast. On Instagram, we're at highfantasypodcast. And on Twitter, we're at podcast_fantasy. And don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube as well.